I'm an advocate for conflict. Conflict is a good thing. It's a natural thing. My mentor, Morton Deutsch, said it's like sex. It's like fundamental to life and decision making and enhancing relationships, enhancing society. So it's a critical component.
Hi, and welcome to the Mindful Negotiating Show. We're so excited that you're here today. We have an incredible guest on the podcast today, Dr. Peter Coleman, who I consider a mentor. I don't know that he knows that I consider him that, but he is just somebody who has done so much for the field of conflict studies. And he's also somebody who walks the talk. He's really interested in bridging research and practice, and that's no small feat. So I greatly admire his work, and I'm so honored that he came on the podcast to talk to you all about it today. He does a lot of work on depolarization, and just there's so many practical lessons from the podcast today, and it was such a treat to have him on and to pick his brain about all things polarization and conflict.
Talking to Dr. Peter Coleman, even though I don't know him, I think as well as you do, definitely one of those beacons in terms of the practice, and definitely when we experience that it's so difficult to negotiate in the type of atmosphere that's going about in the U.S. and elsewhere. This is just someone that I look to for guidance and hope, and so it's really a treat for us to have him.
Yeah, and I did want to say that because of so much of Dr. Coleman's work focuses on polarization, that is what this episode centers around. But I wanted to mention that we briefly discuss the ongoing conflict in the Middle East, and we don't really get into the details of that. Instead, we sort of focus on the ways in which this incredibly tragic and destructive conflict overseas is contributing to polarization among U.S. citizens, and especially on college campuses. But I didn't want to understate the weight of what's going on in the world. We discuss this idea of a third group of activists, not as people who are apathetic or fearful of taking a side, but whose commitment in the face of immense turmoil is to continue the conversation, to hold sacred the importance of dialogue, to fight to understand rather than divide. So in the spirit of that, I just wanted to read something that Dr. Coleman wrote, and we'll provide a link to some of the other things that he's written on this topic. But I thought this was especially poignant. And because we don't really get into the details of the conflict and we stay focused on what's happening in the US, I just wanted to acknowledge that there's a lot there. There's a lot to unpack. And he writes to the question of, most importantly, what should we, the members of Columbia, and he's talking about Columbia University, the university he works at, do now? And here's his answer. He says, honestly, I struggle with this constantly. Do I choose to stand in solidarity with the desperate, deplorable plight of Palestinians in Gaza and elsewhere in the region? Do I help to recognize the impossible security situation faced by Israelis when Hamas, Iran, and their proxies brazenly seek their extermination? Do I speak out of inalienable rights of students and faculty to protest and express even inflammatory versions of their political views against Israel on campus? Or do I prioritize protecting the safety, security, and dignity of the Jews in our community being harmed by these words and deeds? Do I redouble my efforts to teach tolerance, peace, and constructive conflict resolution, or simply give up, throw off the gloves, march, and fight for what I feel in my heart is morally right and salient, at least in this moment? These are just some of the moral dilemmas that keep me up at night.
Well, I'm personally moved because I never know how to approach something as big and as weight. Like, there are so many things that are big and weighty, but when we talk about Israel-Palestine and that history, and there's just such, like, for lack of a better term, a sacred responsibility to, as best we can for people that are mindful of conflict, to not inflame things, right? Something that Peter does super well there is he does the and stance that Shilaheen talks about, that allows for complexity, that resists the idea of polarization, that resists the idea of a binary or just a duality where either I'm Israel or I'm Palestine, like as if there's nothing else to say. But I think that idea of, like, are you Red Sox? Are you Yankees? Are you Black? Are you white? Not to say that these identities don't have meaning and need to be talked about and examined, simply that the either or thinking, at least to my mind, what I think personally, is an American disease, if not a more broad one. And so what I appreciate there is just it, at least for me, captured the many multidimensional pains that I have and that we should continue to hold for the many human beings in the world that are being decimated. And just for me, hopefully for all peacemakers, there's kind of a mantra of like violence is the absence of creativity. Like it is the absolute destruction of something. And we can also think about from a forefather, Johann Galtung, the idea of violence as not just direct violence, but the gap between what is and what could be. And so the way that we speak in terms of the ways that we inflame positionality and ego, et cetera, like we need to look at not just what we're standing up for, but how we do it. And ironically, some of the most vehement or even extremist ways that we try to advocate for position are self-defeating. So
Yeah.
we clearly need to talk more about this. There's just a lot that gets brought up. And I think, Colleen, thank you so much for just kind of raising that. We just wanted to set the container, and we want to be able to hold space for really difficult conversations, and we only get to scratch the surface here.
Yeah. Yeah. And that you can do that with a zero tolerance for violence, right? And a zero tolerance for hate, that's not mutually exclusive. And you reminded me, Max, earlier of the Rummy quote of out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there's a field, I'll meet you there. And I feel like that is the heart and spirit of this conversation. So I hope you all enjoy. Well, I am beyond excited to have Dr. Peter Coleman with us today. Dr. Coleman is an expert on conflict and peace building, and he's currently the professor of psychology and education at Columbia University, where he holds a joint appointment at Teachers College and the Earth Institute. He's involved in a number of initiatives. He's published well over 100 articles, and he's someone whose work I greatly admire. So, Peter, thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Great to be with both of you. Thanks for having me on.
I thought I would start with a question that Max and I sort of come back to, I feel like, at the end of the day, when we've sorted through a lot of literature and asked ourselves hard questions. And it's just this one that sticks with us. Are we addicted as a nation to conflict?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, so it's hard to talk about a nation because it's such a diverse place. There's so many different kinds of people. I think we are addicted to outrage, right? So I think that there is brain science research on this, that when you see a post or an article that is provocative and really irritates you and it triggers a taste for retaliation, it does trigger a part of the brain that is also triggered by narcotics, right? So it does play on an addictive, it's an addictive substance. And so, of course, the media, social media platforms, mainstream media prey on that. Politicians prey on that. So it keeps us engaged and motivated, but it is toxic. And so there is an addiction to that, I think. And of course, it comes from so many sources that it's hard to break. Conflict, I just want to say, I'm an advocate for conflict. Conflict is a good thing. It's a natural thing. My mentor, Morton Deutsch, said it's like sex. It's like fundamental to life and decision making and enhancing relationships, enhancing society, So it's a critical component. The question is always, does it go well? When does it go well and when does it go poorly? I think what we see around political polarization right now is just a lot of destructive conflict that is really about vilifying the other, attacking the other. And so that is an addictive substance, particularly the sort of taste for retaliation that it brings.
Mm. And I'm wondering, I know I've heard you talk about growing up in Chicago during the 60s, which was a very tumultuous time for America. And I'm wondering if there's a time, maybe even later in life, when you had some knowledge about conflict and how conflicts work, if there was a time or a particular conflict that you walked away still feeling puzzled or still confused or still ruminating on what's going on when we're in conflict with one another.
Yeah, I mean, again, to be honest with you, my days are filled with these right now because I'm at Columbia University, where there's been all of this divisiveness and enmity and animosity between faculty members, between students and faculty. It's really, we're in a time when I feel surrounded by these conflicts that just stymie me. One that comes to mind, I write about this in the way out in my book because it was a surprise, which was I was at an event in Germany with a bunch of academics and policymakers and kind of diplomats, and we were talking about a book. We were working on a book about conflict in the Middle East. It was a very esteemed group, and we had 2 days of regular meetings of meetings like that, which are pretty tedious. People present their work, and people get critiqued, and so that went on and on. But towards the end of the last day, the chair, one of the co-chairs of the meeting, who was Israeli, presented his work, and there was a diplomat from Europe who was the respondent, and the first thing the diplomat said was simply, because this book is about Israel and Palestine, and because you're Israeli and an editor, we may the work may attract certain scrutiny or attention. This is the first thing he said. And this Israeli co-chair, who was a kind of high-level negotiator, lost it and immediately said, "What are you saying? What are you insinuating?" And got really triggered, which of course triggered the diplomat, because the diplomat just kept saying, "Look, I'm just saying," and the Israeli wouldn't hear it. It escalated. And so we're in this room with, peace builders, and one at a time, people are doing their best to kind of show up and reframe the conversation and move us in a better direction. And we couldn't do it. We couldn't do it. And ultimately the Israelis packed up and stormed out, and the diplomat as well. And it just, the irony of it was just extraordinary, right? That we're in this middle of this conversation about this conflict, and here we are in a different country, and it still shows up and derails us. And so those kinds of experiences are, both fascinating and just, confusing, because all we knew, all the experience that was in the room didn't matter at that time. Ultimately, the Israeli jumped off the sort of lost contact with this group, jumped off the publication. It didn't end well. Yeah.
Wow.
And Dr. Coleman, I'm a more recent Colemanite acolyte. I grew up as a Fisherite in the kind of Roger Fisher PON tradition, and I'm making my way through and around and out. And I just wanted to say the way out, like that hope, even if you're starting today on a note of the blues, is so helpful for me as a practitioner who on October 7th, and based on my own Ashkenazic background and set of relationships, fell apart. I was just like, I don't even know if I belong in the field. I'm overwhelmed. I feel all the things that I wish I could hold as data, but I know I'm biased. I can't believe I'm identifying, but it's like epigenetic at this point. And so I'm wondering, and I mean this question because I'm someone who grew up in a family where we avoided conflict. And so I became fascinated by it. And I wonder if we think about how certain professions attract certain personalities or based on certain family histories, my question is, are peace builders uniquely bad at building peace or managing conflict?
You mean in their own life?
And with each other even?
Yeah. I mean, again, I think, again, it's hard to essentialize peace builders because there's all different kinds of stripes and shapes. I think that we all, when it's a personal conflict, it triggers us, our identity. It really threatens something that we really value. It's very hard to be centered. It's very hard to walk your talk in those times. I do think that many of the peace builders that I know some peace builders that are just marvelous at this in other settings. And then when it's personal, they lose it. So, I mean, I think it just goes to tell us, to remind us how profoundly emotional conflict dynamics are, right? It triggers our passions. And then, it's the kind of parts of our brain that are not rational. They're not going by the, frameworks and strategies that we know that are helpful. And so we can get derailed, I think, all of us. I think it's just a human thing, I don't know many people that aren't susceptible to that under some conditions, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we are attracted. Peace builders, mediators are attracted to this field for probably some personal reasons in our background, and they may incline us to be particularly good at this with some conflicts. But of course, we all tip.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree with that. I think sometimes at my most honest, I feel like I got into this work because I feel too sensitive for the world and
Yeah.
needed sort of have this high level view to look at it and
Yeah.
understand it. And
Yeah.
I remember feeling like grief was really overwhelming for me, and that poetry and music were the only things that could assuage. So
Yeah.
I wasn't a scientist. I was sort of like interested in the creative arts. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh, there's a science for this. There's a field for this.
Yeah.
And I think the thing that got me hooked was actually something you said earlier, which is that moving from conflict is bad, hard stop, right, to conflict is inevitable. And it can at times be very constructive. And I'm curious to hear your take on that. When can we engage with conflict, or when are good times to engage with conflict in times that we know it'll go well, or have a better idea that it might go well?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some sort of basic, guidelines that you can use about that. One association I just want to make quickly is, so I have a colleague named Padraig Ó Tuama. I'm telling this to you, Colleen, because you're interested in poetry, who is a
Oh boy.
poet. He's an
Yeah.
Irish poet. He's a very well-published poet. He's part of On Beings, which is a NPR
Oh, sure.
show. He's the poet laureate there. And he's a peace builder. He's a peace builder from Northern Ireland, has
Cool.
worked with paramilitary and others. He's worked all around the world. But he uses poetry as a way to stimulate conversations that open people up. And so
Cool.
he's been working with us for a while and doing some workshops and things. And I just want to draw attention to that because he really is a peace builder, but is, fluent in poetry and language and images and the power of that, and really uses it as a way to open people up, right? And sort of elicit their better selves, elicit their compassion and their perspective. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that the the first thing is knowing yourself, right? Knowing when you get triggered, what you get triggered by, how you tend to get triggered. I tend to just go right into my head, whereas my sister goes right into her emotions. And so we're speaking radically different languages and both think each other is crazy. So I think knowing yourself is an important baseline, right? Having some sense of that. But then I think, like, again, as I was saying earlier, I think like all humans, under certain conditions, we're better. If we're well rested, we're better. If we, again, if our identities or our key moral issues aren't being triggered or aren't involved, it's easier for us. There are some conditions that make it easier. But I guess the one adage that I'll say today, because it's so easy today on campus or anywhere just to get triggered by things that are said or not said, is intention, the importance of intention. Because oftentimes today we find ourselves in the elevator, right, with somebody, and we turn and they say something provocative, and off we go. We jump into something, and it takes on a life of its own, and then we leave there thinking, what the heck just happened? And that's a very common thing these days because these issues are so horrible and difficult. The Israel-Gazan problem in particular, but other issues as well. So I think trying to be intentional. When I know I'm going to step into a conversation with someone who is morally opposed to me or politically very different from me, I really have to ask myself, what am I trying to do here? Do I just want to sort of challenge and humiliate them and try to persuade them, because good luck with that? Or am I really trying to understand or connect with them on a more human level? Those are different kinds of processes, cognitive processes, behavioral processes. And you have to be intentional about that, because we're not socialized to do that. We're all socialized to jump into a debate. That's the method of conflict management that we see on television. We see our politicians do it. It's everywhere. And so that's our first, line of defense. And it's oftentimes backfires and is problematic for us. So I think being intentional, knowing yourself, but then being intentional when you're entering or find yourself in a difficult conversation, to kind of ask yourself the question, all right, what do I want to do here? What do I really want to see happen? And is how I'm approaching this going to get me any closer to that?
And I think it was your TED Talk in Miami. You mentioned something, and please clarify if I misstate.
Sure.
Somewhere between 90 to 95% of our actions or behaviors are automatic.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering a few things. I'm wondering if you can say more about that, but also, is this like system one fast thinking? And is it different? And or how do we become more intentional, which might be a more, I don't know, metaphysical question, but how do you think about getting people to look at themselves when we don't want to look at ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, that's to answer the second part of the question, practice, practice, practice.
Yeah.
I think, yes, it is. So automaticity in psychology is the fact that most of our life, you get up, you brush your teeth, you drive the car, you do, listen to the radio. You're not really thinking about what you're doing. You're just going about your life. And that's most of what we do most of the time. And that's true when we get into political conversations or disputes over differences, even just on the sidewalk. We're oftentimes just reacting and responding kind of automatically and not intentionally. And intentionality is hard. I think the Buddhists are better at it, because they're spending a lot of time thinking about all the layers of gauze that we, are seeing the world through. But it's hard. It's hard. It does require sort of a practice. And, again, yesterday I had a listening session with some faculty here who are experiencing tensions around Israel-Gaza. And in that place, I can show up and be very intentional and hear a lot and because I'm prepared for it. It's when we're not prepared for it that, we get triggered and we get in trouble, or we start going down a path that we can't, correct. So I do think it is about practice. The more that we the more we place ourselves in positions where people do differ from us, and we have that opportunity, frankly, to be able to have those conversations, the more we realize how hard they are, but how fruitful they can be if we can ride the wave and listen to each other and move beyond, the sort of initial, fire that takes place, the move into a more of a sense of the humanity of the other. So, and again, I think one of the tragedies of our society right now is we live in these bubbles, we live in these clusters. We only talk to people that we agree with most of the time on social media and in person. And that doesn't afford us, the opportunity to listen to people and have to respond or have to change our approach, right? So ironically, the more you do that, and the more you do that intentionally, the more you build up the sort of muscles that allow you to navigate those kinds of differences more effectively.
Practice, practice, practice.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I'm still practicing, mostly with my family.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, as I mentioned, my family, I am sort of curious about your family life. I think you have a son, if not,
son and a daughter. Yeah.
Son and a daughter.
Yeah.
And if there's any conversation I'm sure of what's going on in the world today, but then also just when you have conflicts, do you talk about conflicts? How do you navigate that at home?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, and it'd be a good question to ask them. My daughter is like 31. My son is 28, I think, or 27. Should know. And they've grown up with me, and my spouse, my wife, Leah, is a psychologist, right? So we're both psychologists of types. She's a clinical psychologist. So of course, talking about one's feelings and all of that kind of comes naturally. I think my son as a child was particularly good at it. I don't know why, he's sort of, as a young, even with his older sister who he adored and will follow to the end of the earth, when they would get in a fight, he'd say, you really hurt my feelings, and I want you to know that. And, and he'd say these things with kind of wisdom. I don't know where it came from. Definitely had a family culture in our nuclear family that was attempted to, have those conversations. They don't always go well. So, we got into trouble at times, and they could get very tense at times. It also just depends sort of developmentally where everybody is, because at certain phases of their development, they were definitely much less open to, having any kind of conversation. But it's also interesting to learn when those conversations can best happen. Like I remember trying to take my son, when he was in high school, and I said, let's go for a walk and sit on a bench and talk. It didn't work. He didn't want to. He didn't. It wasn't. He didn't want to talk to me like that.
Mm-hmm.
What I learned, though, as we started to visit colleges, and then we drove across the country once, is that's a space where he just opens up. Right. We drive in the car. He plays his music for me and educates me about hip hop and rap and great song music that I know nothing about. But in that process, it opens up sort of deeper conversations about the world and each other and our lives. And sitting down and directly doing it with him didn't work. So I think that's part of good parenting, and part of any really probably good conflict resolution is understanding the conditions under which people that you're working with can open up, because it's not always the same. We're kind of idiosyncratic about that.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. And that part of process, even that you can sort of talk about hard things when things are going well, feels antithetical to dealing with conflict. But I totally agree with you that sort of whether or not somebody is open might be the first indication of whether or not we're actually going to be able to have a conversation. So something that I'm thinking about in terms of what's going on with college campuses is how can students sort of engage in more constructive conversations or more dialogue? How can they get out of what feels like sort of a debate us them framework right now?
Well, I mean, in a simple way, it's really just being exposed to an alternative, again, because many of us aren't. We assume that if it's a political difference, you debate. That's how people communicate about things. That's the right way to communicate, is to kind of win points and win a debate. Being exposed to what the alternative is and the value of that alternative, certainly when things are very heated and divisive, is something that we all have to learn. And adults have to learn this. It's not something. I'll tell a quick story, which I also tell on the way out. These are like my go-to stories. But I was invited in 2018, I think, on Twitter to go to a pop-up meeting in Midtown on polarization on the internet. And I was curious because of the people that invited me. So I showed up. It's a lunchtime, it was a snowstorm. And I walked in, and there were sort of, executives from Facebook and Google and Jigsaw and all these places. And then, some pundits in this space. And the facilitator wrote up on the board, what kind of dialogue should we be having to promote a healthy virtual society? Right. That was the question. And I said, well, what do you mean by dialogue? And there was silence. And I said, because in my world, most people mean debate, and debate is a game to win, right? And it's a certain kind of cognitive process of narrowing down and finding the flaws in the other's arguments and weaponizing them. And dialogue is fundamentally different. Dialogue is a space where you actually listen, right? And you don't interrogate one another. And I tell my story, usually my personal story, and you tell yours, and you tell yours. And from that, we start to open up and feel different things and learn about ourselves, because I'll say things and make connections that I haven't made before about an issue because I'm in this space. So it really is an opening space. And so I said this in this room, and one of the founders of Facebook was there, and he said, oh, well, if that's the case, then there's no major social media platform that promotes dialogue. It's all about competition and coercion and contentiousness. That's the coin of the realm. There aren't, he said, Zoom maybe, but there aren't spaces that open people up. And, I remember thinking, we've really, set ourselves up for disaster. But I think that's true. There are, the social media and media platforms don't do that. And so it is necessary that, teachers, colleges, universities, high schools, and even younger start to introduce the idea of what are the kinds of communication processes that connect us and allow us to learn from each other? And it's not a game to win, it's something else. And how do we build that into families, and how do we build that into schools? This is kind of the first institution that young people join. I'll just say that Costa Rica, when they came out of a violent, bloody civil war in 1948 and decided to grow a peaceful society, one of the first things they did was mandate in all of their public schools conflict resolution, tolerance training. They really wanted to grow a more peaceful society. And so they mandated it. And they believed that that was how they were able to eventually grow a different culture.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Go Costa Rica, doing so many cool things. I'm wondering, is part of the issue that skillful, intentional leadership negotiation behavior is just more boring than the sensational kind of outrage that with an addictive quality that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think, I don't know if boring is accurate, but I think definitely contentiousness, competition, threat is very, compelling, right?
Yeah.
If you're walking down the street and nothing's happening, you just walk down the street. If there's a screaming match across the street or an argument or an accident, it gets our attention and we draw, right? So there is something that we're physiologically hardwired to pay attention to threat. And so it is definitely a first order response. And that's why it's what social media platforms prey on, is the more of that, the more engaged people are, the more they'll stay on their platform. So it's not necessarily boring, because the truth is, think if there have been lovely experiences that you've had with people that aren't about that are actually very compelling. It is a challenge, I think, to find a way. This is a colleague of mine, Amanda Ripley, has been doing this with journalists. She has a program called Complicating the Narratives. She trains journalists all over the world in trying to reflect on how journalists contribute to polarization, right? By oversimplifying issues and just bringing in two sides and having them, attack each other. And what's the alternative to that? And how do you, the business model in media and journalism is that, to get attention. So how do you tell a story in a way that's compelling and nuanced and provides context? How do you do both? And again, I think it's easier to just go for the sensational. It's harder to do it in a way that is not toxic and is still compelling. And that's the challenge, I think, for good media, is to figure out how to do that.
Yeah, go ahead, Max.
Just if I can ask, in Crisis, Contradiction, Certainty, and Contempt, a piece that you wrote, came out on the 29th of April. I really appreciated it because I rarely see nuanced anguish about the many layers of things that are happening. And I think the assumption of kind of like bipolarization is that there is an assumption in a very charged atmosphere that if I say one thing, or if I begin with this thing, I privileged it, or I'm prioritizing it over something else.
Yeah.
Like, what is the first apology like I have to make to be in this space and be heard in the way I'd like to be seen?
Yeah.
So you do this, I think, in this article. And so I'm wondering, and again, you have twice refused my my invitation to be unnuanced or simplistic or essentialist. And so I'm wondering, how do you add the nuance that we know that we need in writing or behavior or speaking?
Well, one of the scholars I point out in that piece is a guy named Robert Talisse, who's at Harvard, and he writes about activism, right? I do think, for example, at Columbia, there is a legacy of activism, right? 1960s, we stormed them, we fought the war, we fought apartheid, there is this sort of banner that we carry that we're activists, and mostly progressive activists. So there is an inclination, particularly around young people, but faculty as well. We've recruited faculty that are sort of buy into that, that are really about the kind of activism that is about mobilization and action. Let's go. They're coming for you. Israel they're committing genocide, whatever, and we mobilize people. And what he says is that misses the other half of activism, which is where we take the time to reflect critically and deeply on our moral position, and what are the
Yeah.
dilemmas inherent to that, and what are the trade-offs.
Mhm.
And that's a space that's not activists are not comfortable with, right? Because activists are about, let's go, let's mobilize, let's fight, let's, give me some money and let's march. And one of the groups I talk about in The Way Out is this group of women from Boston who were pro-life and pro-choice activists who agreed to come together, and they're extremely brave under these terrible, violent conditions to talk to each other for a long period of time. And one of the things they said that they really appreciated in that time was that as activists, you don't have time to think about nuance. You don't have time to think about gray. Your job is to just make people afraid and move them, right? And they said in this space, they were actually able to have conversations with members of their own side about their own ambivalence about these issues, right? Because these are complicated, oftentimes contradictory dilemmas that they're facing in their own personal life, but they can't really think about them or talk about them, right? So I do think that that's one of the challenges, is that we see a dichotomy between kind of activism and critical reflection, right? And what Talise sort of says is, if you're going to be a good activist, you should be able to do both, right? Question your own impact, question your own assumptions deeply and critically, and mobilize, right? It's not one or the other. It's a hard thing to do at times like this. I do think particular population on college campuses right now, the younger population, are the COVID kids, kids that graduated high school or didn't graduate from high school because of COVID and have lived in this other world for so long. And so the idea of having a purpose, right, which is against this or against that, it's a tribe. It's a sense of meaning, right? And it really is compelling, which makes sense until you have conversations with them about what it's really about. And there's, oftentimes very superficial understanding of that. And that's problematic, right? That's problematic for the purposes of activism. It's problematic for the end effects of it. It's problematic for our climate, our relationships with each other. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but that's what comes to mind.
Yeah, I'm hearing you talk about this makes me wonder if it's possible to rise up like a third side of activists whose chip on their shoulder is polarization, right?
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, like, I'm just thinking about like family systems therapy, but like it's you and I against the problem. And I think you're right. There's so much need, especially for COVID kids. And I've talked with students where I can just tell they want to figure out who they are. They want to know what they stand for because they've lost so much of that contact time in such formative years.
Yeah.
And I'm just, as you're talking, I'm like, okay, but I don't think we're going to get everyone to sort of reorient to this, but maybe there could be like a third crew that does come in and help with the, what you're talking about of the introspection after the activism. I don't know how that would work, but
absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. And exactly that, the idea of a third way, I think, is critical. I was in Bogota in Colombia, the country, last week or the week before, I guess. And, they're a country that sort of swings from left to right, and they vilify each other and attack each other. And they're also not, again, on a brink of, acute polarization and probably or possibly violence. And that's really what came from it is, even the media gets drawn into the right or the left, and finding a third way, finding this alternative way is critical. And I do think, I would imagine you do, but do you know this group called Birds Aren't Real?
Oh yeah.
Movement, right?
Of course.
So
Yeah.
think about that. That movement was started by some, undergraduate who, was at a pro-life, pro-choice thing and thought this is silly. And so he just put this up and he went with it. And what's interesting is that it became such a powerful movement. And it's a movement around satire, right? So it's a movement to point at how ridiculous oversimplification of complicated issues are, but how susceptible we are. But the people that join it know that this is a joke,
Right.
So in mobile, and there's swag, you can buy T-shirts and about birds. So it speaks to the resonance of something else that's not falling into this or that, but that there is, he believes that a lot of the young people that join this movement would have been susceptible to the others because of the purpose of that. But this was a unique purpose, which is poking fun, but also saying this isn't helpful, right? And see how easy it is to sort of, create narratives that are ridiculous, but people buy into, right?
I love that.
Yeah.
Now I want to, yeah.
I mean, I don't know if we want to go here, Dr. Coleman, totally up to you.
Yeah.
Religion comes to mind, specifically like a social theory of religion, the reasons we band together, the things we hold sacred or profane, and sometimes in terms of this intentionality versus the automatic way we act. You could talk about mindfulness. You could talk about, like, in a Catholic sense, like fallingness, that we're just like kind of like asleep in the way that we walk. So I'm also thinking, not just because of, how Israel Gaza brings up the Abrahamic faiths, or I should say Abrahamic religions. I'm just wondering what, if any, influence you see in terms of religion and religiosity on our fervor and what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, religion's, I think, an interesting thing, because most of the major religions have awesome things about them, about service and compassion, and like two of my colleagues, I think I can out them. John Paul Lederach is an evangelical Christian, and Andrea Bartoli, who is a Roman Catholic, are world-class peacemakers. Mm-hmm. And they kind of, Andrea got into it because he was doing kind of anti-poverty work with the community of San Egidio around the world. And because they were sort of trusted people in war zones, they were approached to help, right? And so there can be tremendous value to true believers that, use those powers to unite and not divide, right? Not to isolate. It's kind of like anything else. I mean, you can use political parties to unite and not divide, right? Or ideologies, progressivism and conservatism, and so I think it is when they're used to divide, when they're used to see us as different and as chosen and not them, that's when they become problematic, right? And then, of course, it's about God. It's about truth. It's about your, sort of fundamental belief system. And those are hard nuts to crack, because then there isn't a logic beyond, but this is true, right? This is what God said. It's the word of God. So that's a hard thing to negotiate. But again, I'm slow to criticize religion, because it can do such great things. It can provide people with a sense of faith and power and beauty and connection across differences. And when it does that, it's awesome. But again, it can also simply be weaponized. The movement in this country right now to make this a white nationalist Christian society, as if we were ever that, but that's the movement now, is a divisive pathology, right? And so any group that does that, religious or otherwise, is part of the problem.
Yeah. You mentioned in your book this idea of perceptual distortion, that we just have a really false understanding of what's going on with the other side. Yeah. And as I'm hearing you talk about religion, I'm thinking about the times. So my master's was in divinity. Max also has religion in his background, so it's something we talk about often. Yeah. And some of the most transformative times were in sort of rooms of hotbeds of really religious, really sort of contentious conversations about religion and faith. Yeah. And I'm just reflecting on when I felt safe, that was like the best thing ever, right? Yeah. And people felt vulnerable. It felt like we were getting somewhere. And then, and maybe this is actually to your story earlier of your colleague, when that changes, when you feel unsafe, when you feel like somebody's coming for identity, there's a real, sort of defense mechanism that goes up. Sure. And I guess part of what I'm curious about is some of what we're asking people to do, and you talk about this really well in the book, is to get uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you have an understanding of the difference or the different climates between safe and comfortable, unsafe and uncomfortable, and what that takes.
Well, again, to sort of go back to your first premise about misperception, I think a lot of us are afraid to talk to people who are different from us because we think they're crazy or they are going to attack us or they're going to assume the worst or whatever. And so that's a big barrier to understanding how uncomfortable can you be. And one of the, I don't know if I wrote a series in Time magazine last year or a year and a half ago or so. And one of the things I talked about is a neighbor of mine in this building who I became alienated from soon after Trump was elected. He was an ardent supporter of Trump, kind of pro-Putin, had these ideas, and it was just being very provocative. He'd get in the elevator with me and say things like, "So, I imagine you're going to go to that climate change walk today, right? I imagine you're going to waste your day doing that.
Protect the earth."
Yeah. So he was, he had his strong opinions and would provoke. And after a time, I just disengaged. I thought, I don't want to, there's no talking to him. There's no talking him through this. He's intentionally being provocative. So I really disengaged for about a year and just, I'd see him and say, hey, and then just sort of move on. And it wasn't that we were close, we were acquaintances, and I knew him from seeing him with his family and things. But I really felt like, I started to think he was crazy because of some of the positions that he had. And then I wrote that damn book, The Way Out. And about a year after it, I thought, okay, so what does this really look like, right? So I did. I reached out to him. I emailed him and said, would you go for a walk with me in the park? And he wrote back and said, so I'm happy to have a conversation with you, but why walk in the park? Are you CIA? Are you worried about surveillance? And so I said, I'll explain it to you, but so we did. We eventually arranged for a walk. I was really nervous. He was really nervous. It was clear. We met in front of the building. The first thing he said to me is, my wife's not feeling well, and so I may not be able to stay very long. So, let's make this quick. And, and I said, okay, all right, no worries. But we went through the process, and we basically went through the sort of 5 steps that I talk about in the way out. I was very intentional about how I framed it, how we started. I said, who are you? Tell me where you're from. What's your story? And he asked me the same. There was some commonality before we moved into politics, right? And again, I was nervous. I've been in difficult situations mediating this. I was sick to my stomach. So I was not comfortable doing this.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
But did it. It was helpful. It turned out to be very useful for both of us. And we've continued to be in communication. He now will email me. His son is actually at Columbia. And his son, wears a kippah and is
wow.
And so they've been nervous about that. So he immediately contacted me and said, what are you doing that can help with this? And what's the status there? Anyway, so we opened up a conversation and, we still disagree on things. He still says provocative things, but I know who he is now. And I have other levels of understanding of him. And I think he, me. And so I can tolerate the comments, and I don't overreact to things that are probably jokes or provocations just for their own purpose, because now I have a better sense of who he is and where his politics come from, right? And again, we don't do that very often. It's very, you have to sort of choose to do that, and it's not easy. But it is very fruitful and very powerful if you can allow yourself to do it.
Yeah. You mentioned going for a walk. When we were in Singapore together, Peter and I were in Singapore together for a conference, and he led this wonderful session in which he had
Greece,
us all.
I think, right?
Oh, in Greece. Sorry.
Yeah,
yes,
Singapore
in
is
Greece.
this year, but Greece, yes.
Yes.
Thessaloniki, I think we were.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And you had us go for a walk, which was funny to sort of get in a room and then ask a bunch of academics to get up and go for a walk. Yeah. Which I really enjoyed. And now is a really huge thing for me and a part of my personal life in resolving conflict and also my work. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why walking.
Yeah.
Why did you ask him to go for a walk, and what's that?
Yeah, I think it's a it's an underused technique in our field because we usually bring people to a table, have them sit aside of each other. It's easier to see the other as the problem when they're across the table from you, and we try to unpack things there. Sometimes it's useful and necessary to recognize that, our differences, our conflicts, our views of the other can really settle into our neurological structures, and sometimes they need to be shaken up a bit. And so that might just mean turning on music and dancing like an idiot alone, or it might mean walking with someone, ideally side by side outside, because there's something about that particular dynamic that neuroscience is telling us helps. It helps people connect in terms of compassion and cooperation and feeling similarity. You're sort of moving through the world and seeing the same thing move past you. And there's something about that that's different than just sitting in a static place. So there's neurological research that suggests it's helpful. And the truth is, diplomats figured this out years ago when they would get stuck. Some of them would say, let's take a walk and see what, and so there are accounts of that. And then there's, in terms of religious differences, there is this thing in the Middle East called Abraham's Path.
Pass initiative, yeah.
Right, which Bill Urey and a group of people sort of constructed. And it is a space, ideally, that's multi-denominational groups get together and they sort of walk, Abraham's trek with his family across different societies. It's a combination of an economic development project because it brings tourists and people through a lot of communities that could use their support, and it encourages people to trek together, right? And that happens there, but also has been picked up by religious communities around the world who sort of just do those locally. So I think there's a lot of power in it. It's not a magic bullet. It's not the solution. But when I've done it myself and when I've seen other groups do it, particularly around very divisive issues where it's hard to sit in a room with somebody, but you might be able to, at least in a group, walk together. There can be something very powerful about that.
Yeah, hard to multitask on a walk as well. So I wonder if listening increases.
Yeah, you can't get on your phone. You can't answer your email. That's right.
Yeah. I'm wondering if this is a hard question.
Okay.
Maybe it won't be for you.
Let's go for a walk.
Yeah. I'm wondering who, if anyone, political or otherwise, might be the right person to unite us, or maybe it's the right group of people. I'm thinking it's not Trump. That's not in his values. I don't think it's Biden. He'd lose a bunch of people. At least half the country, if not, Who do you think, or what could that look like, or who are you most hopeful in doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. Somebody raised that recently, and I don't know politically who can do that. It may have to, when Biden was elected, his transition team reached out to me through a group and said, he wants to unite the country. What can he do? And I sort of said, not much, that he can not make things worse by vilifying, but he's seen as illegitimate by half the country. So there's politicians are really stuck in a place. But I want to point to one group. So there's and I've written about this, and maybe you've heard about this, but there's a group in Congress called the Select Committee for the Modernization of Congress that was co-chaired by Derek Kilmer and then William Timmons and others, so Democrats and Republicans, and they were very smart and intentional so they were brought together about 3 years ago with the objective of fixing Congress, right? This is a mechanism Congress has. Usually it doesn't work, but in this case, their mandate was to fix the polarization and dysfunction of Congress. They started before the January 6th incursion. And at that time, nobody they interviewed all these people, and nobody wanted to sit down with the other side. And then January 6th happened, and he thought, "Oh, now we're really in trouble." And yet he was smart, and he kind of called in people, Amanda Ripley, Adam Grant. We had a conversation, and others, and started to say, what do I do? How is this useful? And so he used certain ideas and best practices from science and conflict resolution management to regroup and to leverage the crisis. One of the first things they did is have a retreat. And at the retreat, they told their stories of that day. And many
Oh,
of them
wow.
were
Yeah.
in their office with CNN on mute, with the people outside their door, with their back to the doors, people banging on their doors, trying to come for them, and texting their family that this might be goodbye.
Wow.
So many of them had gone through similar kinds of terrifying experiences that day, and that's where they started. And then from that, they decided, what Derek talks about is the need to think different. The business as usual was totally dysfunctional. We as a committee had to really do this differently. And so he made all kinds of decisions that operationalized that. And ultimately, they were an immensely effective task force. They made 203 recommendations to the leadership in Congress. A third of them were almost immediately implemented. Another third of them are, I think, being implemented right now.
Oh, great.
So and again, these were not dramatic changes. What they realized is that our political system is broken. They were in Congress. That was sort of the epicenter of this tension, and on the heels of January 6th. But they could look at the incentive structure of Congress itself and make some changes. And there were many of them simple changes, like the fact that there are cameras everywhere in Congress. So whenever I speak to another congressperson, I'm on camera, which means I'm not talking to them, I'm talking to my base, right? Or the news, right? So there's no chance for people to be candid, right? It's always politicking. So they said, give them spaces. They made, 200 recommendations for nudges like that to change the incentive structure of Congress and eventually grow a new Congress. I went to them. He became chair of the bipartisan committee in Congress, problem-solving group, which deals with policy differences. I went to them a year and a half later, and what that group said is that what the select committee had done had been to some degree contagious, and other subcommittees in Congress were starting to adopt some of their practices. So it's a very heartening story. And Derek, I think, is an example of a really decent person, right? He's a Democrat. He immediately got in office, was on a bus the first day. Afterwards said, I'm going to go for a burger at this place. I heard it's good. I'm going to come with me. And Republicans, they had like half a dozen people go with him. Built a relationship with Tom Cotton right away, right? So was in some ways unsocialized and naive and willing. And that's how he's navigated politics. The bad news is he's leaving, of course. He's leaving at the end of this year. I think it's been hard on his life and his family and stuff. But it's an example of how this can happen, right?
Yeah.
And how people can do this. And so I think that's who we have to find, is the people that have the courage and the wherewithal to do, as you say, a third way. It doesn't have to be pure this or pure that, even though that's what the external party system is telling you to do, but to find this other way and to get your constituents to buy into that. And so I think there will be some new leaders like that ideally someone will intentionally fund and promote. But it's going to take a little while to grow that, and we got to get through the next year first.
Yeah.
So, Peter, do you want to start the third side party with us, where we cannot take a stance on anything, but insist on process and building the container? I'm kind of half joking because I'm thinking, as you were talking about the different spaces in the Senate, the way in which the panopticon or public spectacle gladiator arena of the Senate floor is so poorly designed, or it's a crucible for conflict. It's gladiatorial in a way, and it's two-sided. And I think we could have a whole other conversation, the religiosity of only having two categories, and one is inherently good and one is inherently bad, heaven or hell, male, female, all these things. We can take this in different directions, but I'm just curious in terms of thinking about the structure and trajectory of communication. Is there a constructive use for social media? Is there a peace-building way to be on social media? Or might it be a structural thing like the Senate floor that could use the development of other spaces?
Yeah, no, there isn't yet, but there are emerging technologies that can do it. So I mentioned I was in Columbia, the country, a couple weeks ago, and gave a talk that was nationally televised to a group of leaders. And the reason I was there is because in 2021 there was a lot of social unrest in Columbia because of inequality, and people were getting violent, particularly in Cali and a couple of neighborhoods, which is a city there. And a colleague of mine, who I didn't know at the time, started to read about polarization, and he read The Way Out. And he thought to himself, how do I apply this framework here? And so, again, as I said, usually it's the left or the right. And he designed an approach, because what they usually would do is just go in and arrest the protesters and put them in jail, and then, make them more radicalized and whatever doesn't work. So they really tried to think about, how do you use this? So a business association collective decided to go into these neighborhoods, these hotspots, meet with and talk to and walk with and work with the protesters, get to know them, get to understand what's important to them. And then part of what they did as this initiative is they hacked social media, because they were tracking social media, and there were a lot of bots and a lot of animosity being ginned up on social media against the protesters and for the protesters. And what this community did is they went in and learned what was important to the protesters, and then they had, and it was opportunity. They wanted a chance to make a living and grow a family, whatever. So they hacked social media, offering those opportunities, and it overwhelmingly transformed the landscape of the conversation. So they were very intentional about how they did that. It wasn't something they made up. It was something they actually followed through on. But there are examples of that. There's a whole example in Taiwan with the Minister of Digital Spaces there, who's using social media around engaging with local communities in terms of informing governmental decisions. So there are promising episodes or examples of people that are thinking pro-socially about social media, but maybe that will be a conversation for another interview.
Yeah. What a good idea. Just attack those goals with other options. Can you talk just a minute or two about the Polarization Detox Challenge and how we can be more involved with that?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I wrote this book in 2021. About a year later, I realized nobody reads books anymore. So, okay, what do we do? And I had a conversation with my daughter, who's way smarter than me. And she said, well, you got to break it down for people, because these are big ideas, and some of it's hard. And so we literally took the 5 principles of the book and sort of generated 100 different things that you could do in your life, small daily, exercises that you could do. 100 was too much, so we simplified it. And then there's a group called Starts With Us that Daniel Lebetsky founded, which is a nonprofit group that's trying to deal with polarization in the U.S. And they set up a website, and we called it the Polarization Detox Challenge. It's something you can sign up for. It sends you, notices, I guess, 5 days. The idea is you try to join for 4 weeks. First week, you focus on you and your inclinations. Second week, you focus on your own in-group and how hard it is to have those conversations candidly. Third week is, how do you prepare to reach across the divide, like I did with my neighbor. Mm-hmm. And then the fourth week are finding community groups that are actually bringing Red and Blue Americans together to do stuff. Community gardens or Habitat for Humanity.
Cool.
There are many of them. So it kind of scales up like that. Anyway, if you go to it either Starts With Us or the Polarization Detox Challenge, and we can share the website with you, you can just sign up, and then it sends you notices and you can engage. We recommend that you do it with other people. You do it with a friend, you do it with somebody who's politically different from you, you do it at work, somebody, so that you have people to complain about it with, because it's a really important community centered aspect of it when you can talk about what you're doing. But that's one way we just tried to make this a little more sticky for people that maybe won't read a book.
Great. That's
Wonderful.
fantastic. We will make sure we give that website to people. And I do want to plug the book because I loved it. And
It's fantastic.
I think you're right. Most people aren't reading as much, but you can listen to it as well. It's called The Way Out. And something that has stuck with me is that you say, when possible, get complicated, get patient, and get future oriented. And I just think that's such an important thing when we feel like those emotions are taking over us. So thank you so much, Dr. Coleman, for being with us today. A lot of really great insight. We really appreciate it.
Fun to do. Thank you for having me. Send me the link and we'll share it around when it comes out.
Sounds great.
All right.
Great to meet you,
All
sir.
right. Be well. Take care.
You too.
You as well.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for listening to the Mindful Negotiating Podcast. We hope you enjoyed listening to Peter as much as we did. If you'd like more of this, there is more stuff. You can find links that we mentioned on our website, on our social media at Mindful Negotiating. And see you next time.